One of the emerging themes of my videos has been the recognition that many arguments online devolve due to a lack of clear communication, that few people genuinely understand the other side's viewpoint, and that often there is more shared ground than the bickering ideologues realize. If you have spent any time in the absolute mess that is gender discourse, you have witnessed the former for sure. Trans activists so infrequently engage with their detractors that they often cannot even put the opposing viewpoint into words, and counter-trans opponents or outsider skeptics find themselves scratching their heads as they unearth multiple, seemingly conflicting explanations of gender theory, and try to sum them up into a single definition. The end result are arguments that go into twisted, tortured knots, a confused waltz that ends where the conversation began. Therefore, I will here be taking pains to unravel the centers of this confusion, though I will weave my own criticisms, thoughts, and opinions throughout. Hopefully this can serve as a clarifying space about the trans and counter-trans world, each of which, as I will soon explain, encompass a variety of ideologies and perspectives. We often enter disputes thinking that the pro and anti-sides are a uniform party, but as you will see, when it comes to the trans question, these polar sides are rife with internal conflict. In fact, we will find their disagreements are fundamental and not easily bridged, and have wedges in both prescriptive and descriptive arguments.
It's an incoherent, literally impossible
description of the definition, but what is the definition?
Wait, what is the definition? There isn't a single one. We have a hodgepodge, and the hodgepodge is the definition.
How you were named, what clothes you wear, expectations about what jobs you can do, and you get the point.
Because there's no one way to express masculinity or femininity. That's for you to decide.
Girl, boy, man, woman, unicorn. With so many gender identities and terms being used, gender can be confusing to anyone. Gender is a social construct used to characterize traits within a person. People have put these arbitrary ideas of gender onto virtually everything.
From genitals,
types of clothing, career paths, and even color. In today's society, tuxedos, penises, the color blue, and a love of football are considered masculine gender markers.
Gender. A disambiguation. Maybe you're thinking, oh boy, yet another YouTuber tries to define gender, but have you seen other YouTubers try to define it? It's an unmitigated disaster. Most of the time their definitions are as vacuous as it's how you feel, or it's society's imposed rules, or something even like it's your internal sense of gender, none of which actually gets at the particulars of the matter. What feelings? What rules? What senses? So overall, I dislike the term gender because at its core, it's so broad as to be nearly useless. It covers a huge range of traits, some of which are entirely cultural and others that have roots in biology. However, this is the task I have at hand, so let me break down some of the items that are going to be usually referred to when we talk about gender as opposed to sex. First, we have what I call cultural sex heuristics. We have these because we don't walk around naked, and we don't particularly like people examining our genitals. So instead we have these attributes that signal our sex. These are culturally variant, but they consistently exist across cultures. These are things like clothing styles, jewelry, makeup, mannerisms, speech patterns. These are things that are aesthetic. They are learned through the culture, through socialization. These are not biological, though certainly the reason for inventing them in the first place was. The purpose of these heuristics is simply to telegraph sex from afar. You can look at someone from far away without the need to closely physically examine them and know if they are male or female. Next up are behavior differences. So we can see these across cultures as well. Distinguishing patterns of male and female by socialization styles, personality trait distributions such as aggression and neuroticism. We can see different linguistic patterns between males and females. We can see differences in hierarchy formation and cooperation. We can see behaviors based on physiological differences. These behaviors are distributed across the two sexes, but not in an even or categorical way. Instead, we envision these as distributive properties, where males tend to possess more masculine behaviors and females tend to possess more feminine features. Next is customs. These are culturally determined as well. These are traditional jobs, positions, or hierarchical statuses. Every culture decides what jobs are masculine or feminine. Sometimes these are based on biological realities or limitations. Some of them are arbitrary. Some of them are just happenstance based on historical or geographical location. Some jobs vary quite a bit between cultures, but others don't vary widely, such as the position of being a soldier versus a homemaker. Very few items in this long list of gendered qualities are strictly biological. And as for the few of them that are rooted in biological differences between the sexes, they are only such at a group level distribution. That means that these qualities are not definitional. They cannot be used to diagnose an individual as one sex or the other. Instead, they merely describe broader patterns that occur across the two groups. These are useful to note when we try to understand sexed patterns in society. Why do men and women tend to enter different job fields? Why do they, as groups, have differences in rates of criminality, depression, eating disorders, suicide attempts, and other behavioral metrics? We can look at these trends and acknowledge that some of them are consistent and biologically rooted, the result of natural bell curves. All that being said, here's my simple and digestible definition of gender. Those traits that are associated with, but not definitional to, the categories of male and female. If you stripped a male and female of all of these, if you removed all the clothing and stylings, all the behaviors, attitudes, career choices, personalities, language tics, gestures, social significance, if all this disappeared with the snap of my fingers, all that is left is the naked material of the two sexes. Sex is the solid, structured base. Gender is all the fluffy icing on the cake, the stuff we add for the pleasure of convenience, aesthetic, and observation. The Great Divide. Trans. One thing that you may be dimly aware of but not fully know is that trans is an umbrella encompassing conflicting views on sex and gender. As much as different trans factions want to believe they are unified, in fact, they have been at war for a little over a decade over the central question: what exactly is trans? To delineate the difference in these primarily two factions, I'm going to refer to one group as transsexual and the other as transgender. The term transsexual is often regarded as outdated and offensive, but I'm going to use it like so. The transsexual hopes to transition their sex, to transform their biological sexual form to match their internal feelings. I'm using transsexual, therefore, in place of true scum or transmedicalist. On the other hand, transgender here will refer to those who wish to identify as the other gender, without need of dysphoria and with the belief in the fluidity of gender, in place of common terms like TRA, trans radical activist, or the derogatory too cute. The antiquated nature of the term transsexual, I hope, makes it easier to remember that this group came first on the scene, and that transgender is a fairly new phenomenon as far as its ideology is concerned. The main conflict between transsexual and transgender camps is in that question: who gets to be trans? For the transsexual, gender dysphoria is the medical condition that necessitates transition, therefore making one trans. Those who enter the transition scene with no dysphoria at all are seen as trenders, pretenders, interlopers who are adopting identities for little reason beyond the desire to roleplay. For the transgender, on the other hand, this gatekeeping is unnecessarily exclusive. For them, all that's needed to justify a gender transition is self-identification, a loose feeling of association with a particular gender. The transgender just about always socially transitions, but when it comes to medical transition, it is out of a desire to fit in, not as a treatment for dysphoria. Where the transsexual sees their gender as a biological mechanism, whether some unproven hidden type of intersex, or an inbuilt perception of one's true sex, or as a stubborn mental condition that forces them to view themselves as the opposite sex, the transgender has seemingly thrown up their hands in surrender, admitting that they don't actually know what gender is, and that they don't really care to know. Gender is for them merely a political alignment, a deity they swear fealty to, a persona they adopt. If you challenge them on this identity, their reasoning will go no further than "I say, therefore I am." Push them to define their terms, and they will admit to having no definition. Explain that you do not accept their identity, and they will say you are denying their existence. Once the argument dead ends and they have nowhere to go, the transgender will ask why you care so much. Their unique claim to metaphysical reality shouldn't matter to anyone outside themselves, even though their claim relies on everyone around them playing along without question. The transsexual at least holds a tenuous grasp on the difference between desire and being. They know they are not the object they desire, and so seek out remedies for this inescapable mismatch. The transgender has thrown out the object but somehow not the desire. They chase not a biological category but a ghost of free-floating qualia, feelings about feelings. So when a transgender says gender, you might as well replace the word with spirits, fairies, or body thetans. Hans Mueller constructed a theory of identity that maps very well onto this shift from gender tradition to transsexual to transgender. Traditional gender falls under the sincerity model, which he describes as the formation of identity as it relates to the role one plays in a family or tribe. Next is the individualistic authenticity model, where one's identity is formed by independent expression of the interior self. For the transsexual, the true gender must be lived out authentically. Before the transgender, it is the prophylicity model that matches best. The curation of a gender profile that is shaped by image, aesthetic, feel, and perception. It makes sense that our beliefs about gender have gone down this line. Why wouldn't it? As we became used to living under avatars and online handles, so too our sense of self has become fluid and perception-based, or in Mueller's terms, second-order observation-based. Who's to say when I live online as a cat and put on the behaviors, names, and imagery of a cat, I am not, identity-wise, ontologically, validly feline? The transsexuals' concerns have been historically focused on the physical, how to live in the physical world, passing as a material construction of their desired life. But for the transgender, no need for this physical world exists. It is almost all online play, and even when it crosses into the real world, it maintains this facade of the digital being the hyper-real. What seems to be the steepest disagreement between the two camps is the nature of these elements. Transsexuals believe sex and gender are both real and biological material things that can be measured or diagnosed. Transgenders, on the other hand, do not have a vested interest in either being biological. They see it all as nonsense that can be deconstructed into non-categories with enough work. Transsexuals wish to be accepted into the structured sexed world. Transgenders wish to expand gender into an infinite individual loci. They say everyone has a unique gendered experience and invent xenogenders daily because ultimately they don't believe gender can be categorized. It's hard to say who comes out as more correct here. The transsexuals are likely correct that gender dysphoria, at least, is a medical condition worthy of medical treatment. But sometimes this leads to the erroneous conclusion that people are born with the wrong body, as if somehow a brain is not developed in the same genetic soup as the rest of you, or by claiming that their gendered traits prove they are truly a member of the opposite sex, trapped by the misfortune of their birth. However, plenty of gender is not biological. Wanting to wear a dress and heels is a cultural artifact, yet one's resistance or inclination towards those clothes is often repeated as evidence of biological transness. And of the gendered traits tied to biology, none of these are definitional. A female can be aggressive. A man can be shy. A female can like fixing cars, and a male can enjoy gabbing with friends at a book club. No one, and I mean actually no one, argues that males and females with non-standard gender traits lose access to their sex categorization. This step only seems to be accepted when individuals use those traits as justification for their desire to leave. And frankly, the mere desire to be included in a category is insufficient. Meanwhile, the transgender conception of gender is so loose and amorphous that their claims are unverifiable at best and contradictory at worst. They rightly identify that much of what we call gender is arbitrary, because it is, but some of it isn't. Some of it is shockingly consistent through culture and time period. They ignore this, though, and have gone on to say that not only is gender a social construct, but, surprise, sex is a social construct too, and also feminine and masculine are fake. And you can identify as deer gender, robot gender, or fire gender. Gender is utterly detached from anything material. This means, interestingly, the transgender has now come to a new conclusion. For them, sex and gender are not truly separate. Gender informs sex. You can determine not only your gender, but your true sex through personal introspection and identifying one's cluster of associated but also immaterial traits. Thus, a trans woman is a woman socially and, therefore, arguably biologically. I suppose this is fine for a religious belief, but it conflicts with the actual materialist framing of trans issues. They want gender to replace sex as a protected, immutable trait. They want to ban gender conversion therapy, whatever that entails. They balk at the idea of simply accepting your sex and socially constructing your way out of transness. Gender for them is intangible, fluid, flexible, yet, in the next breath, rigid, unalterable, and strict. Gender has no form, but also no malleability. Furthermore, the transgender will say male and female don't really exist, or at least the association of traits to these binaries is socially constructed, but also you can become masculine or feminine. By what merit? How is it that the associations we have with the two sexes are arbitrary, but also completely and utterly definitional? Ultimately, the claim that gender is totally socially constructed undermines the urgency of the trans situation. At least for transsexuals, they can point to biological mental distress that will lead to suicide. The brain cannot bear living in a mismatched body, as they would say. But for the transgender, gender dysphoria is optional. You don't need distress to be trans. You can just desire a gender and pursue it. I can't help but find it distasteful when these individuals who say they experience no dysphoria, no distress about their bodies, trot out transsexual suicide rates as proof that everyone should comply with their personal gender journey, like drug users citing cancer patients to explain why you're a bigot for not lauding their habit. Yes, being transgender might be socially isolating, and that in itself may cause depression and even suicide, but it's a choice of self-categorization. It's a social construct, and you've decided what construct you'd like to occupy. You could just as well keep all your immutable traits and arbitrarily hop the line over to cisgender, because what's the difference? There's simply no urgent need, in this view, for a female with masculine gender traits to identify as a man. It's worse than pointless. It's self-sabotage. I don't know where trans issues will be going next. I suspect the conflict between transsexual and transgender will continue to devolve and result in confusion and obfuscation. Both groups have experienced political success in their own right. Their ideas have mainstreamed, and they're now accepted unquestionably by medical and educational institutions. However, there has also been significant pushback, and though said pushback has been hindered by censorship and left-leaning societal pressure, nonetheless, we've seen the emergence of a counter-trans alliance of disparate ideology, composed of a diverse set of people with surprisingly divergent views. The tenuous counter-trans alliance. Just as people don't understand the nuances of the different trans camps, I found that trans activists really don't understand the views of people who argue with them. The biggest confusion lies in their lumping of all counter-trans individuals into one collective they like to call TERFs. This leads to bizarre accusations, like calling gender criticals right-wing, or calling right-wingers radical feminists. TERF is a punchy pejorative to throw around, but it's not helpful in describing the beliefs of their opponents. There's actually a number of fundamental disagreements and contrary philosophies at work in the counter-trans world: a progressive, conservative, and liberal wing. These distinct camps, under normal circumstances, are at each other's throats over other policy and cultural issues. Their alliance now against trans identity is specific, narrow, and barely strong enough to keep their interfaith dialogue going. In some ways, I see it more as a momentary ceasefire than an alliance, with the occasional shot still taken. First, we have the gender criticals, the progressive wing. They hold the view that gender is socially constructed and a negative, limiting construction at that. Gender-critical feminists in particular, often called TERFs, believe that the association of different traits to masculine and feminine dimensions is oppressive, specifically the fault of the patriarchy. Men oppress women by maligning them as fragile, weak, neurotic, and so on, and oppress other men by pressuring them into adopting masculine attributes. For the gender-critical, trans ideology places inappropriate emphasis on gendered traits, thereby falling for an oppressive social construct that limits how men and women can exist. Men are male, women are female, all men of any gender expression are still men. Women of any gender expression are still women. Biological sex is a reality that cannot be escaped. And in fact, by making gender more important, we risk losing sight of real, measurable, sex-based oppression. Next, the conservative wing. The gender positives. Gender positives agree with gender criticals that sex is biological and that gender is a social construct. They also align with gender criticals on issues of sex-based protections and rights. Although they acknowledge that gender traits are somewhat arbitrary and not fully tied to biology, they believe that gender is not oppressive, but an important technology for the socialization and structure of sex society. Some gender positives are religious conservatives who think it's important to teach children to align with their sex's connotations and social roles. We must teach boys to be like men, and girls likewise. Otherwise, society will fall apart. But there are also non-religious or atheist gender positives who simply see gender as something of utility. Tradition has handed down gender associations not arbitrarily, but for good society-building reasons. In order to help children grow up to be happy, well-liked, accepted, and adapted, we teach them the gender customs they will see lived out in their world. Gender positives will vary a bit where they draw the line in enforcing those rules, but they do not see these structures as oppressive or patriarchal, nor as necessarily biologically innate. Finally, we have gender realists, representing the liberal wing. These are a mixed bunch. Biologists, physicians, sociologists, psychologists, journalists, or skeptical transsexuals can fall under this wing. Gender realists believe biological sex is important, especially for the diagnosis of disease, the understanding of sex differences, psychology, sports, medicine, society, and so on. When they talk about gender, their views are a bit more mixed. While they agree much of the social convention around gender is culturally created, gender realists see the connection between sex and gender more complexly. They see clear biological associations between certain gender traits and their associated sexes, and they think that these are helpful in describing group differences. They see gender as neither oppressive nor as a tool for building society, but as a biological behavior that offers insight. As such, some gender realists believe that gender dysphoria has a biological cause and that transition is appropriate. Some trans medicalists and trans people belong to this cluster. Others disagree with medical interventions for dysphoria and dispute the quality of outcomes. But where they all agree is in their skepticism of the claims of individuals holding an innate gender identity. Gender realists are materialists. They are interested in where sex and gender interact in material physiology and behavior, not in wide-eyed metaphysics. The open question about this alliance is where, in the end, a victory would lead. Should radical feminists, biologists, conservatives, and others succeed in dispelling the notion of transgenderism, making it fade away like other social fads, extremely crucial questions are still on the table. While their material understanding of the world is pretty dang close, they all agree that sex is biological and that gender is largely cultural. Their visions of the proper order of society can't coincide. Should they win, the next culture war will be once more about gender, but this time the schism will be between those who see gender traits as oppressive, necessary, or up to individual choice. Already, if you look at gender-critical spaces, there's an awful lot of toxic infighting over trivial issues, and I can only guess this will further spiral as the current wave of gender identity extremism recedes. Is the masculine-feminine dichotomy good? Is it helpful? Is it beautiful? Is it accurate? Is it learned or somewhat biological? Should our aim be to make men and women more similar and more equal? Or should we find ways to permit or even encourage differences in some complementary balance? Those who oppose gender identity should be prepared to accept that even without trans ideology, sex and gender are still quite complicated. Still, I think there's reason for the counter-trans camp to be hopeful. Given that these widely different philosophies have been forced to collaborate, share notes, and campaign together, it may be that some of the extremes can be softened. Perhaps some radical feminists can be talked down from hating all men. Maybe hard-nosed gender role enforcers on the right can be persuaded that cross-gender play and nonconformity can be creative and beneficial. The realists might start to come out of their academic shell and think about how biological concepts actually manifest for real people in the world. Regardless, this moment has offered people on opposite ends of the gender war a chance to engage in real and difficult conversations, ones worth having. Untangling. In pinpointing where the conversation around gender goes wrong, consider this scenario. For the sake of ease, let's imagine an individual speaking to a trans woman. This individual, in the course of the conversation, says, "You're not a woman." This statement would have landed differently in another era, perhaps interpreted as a form of rudeness, along the principle of, just because it's true doesn't mean you should say it. An old-school transsexual might, if they keep a cool head, agree that they aren't a woman in the sense that they were not born as one, but they desire to be and live their life as one, and have committed to various means to accomplish this transition. For some transsexuals, they might be offended in another way entirely. "I'm not a woman? What do you think, I don't realize this? Why do you think I'm trying to transition?" This is because in that context, this person and the transsexual understand the term woman to mean a particular thing. It's a category without value. It's a mere physical descriptor. It's not the personal feeling related to it, it's not any of the gender traits associated with it, It's not the social importance of it. No, it is the thing itself. But for the new transgender, the term woman is not a mere situation within a category. It is an artifact assembled and composed of all the personal, intimate, experiential feelings one has about the social role of womanhood. The aesthetic, the behaviors, the emotions, everything. To tell a trans woman they are not a woman is to negate and erase all these intensely private attributes of their identity, so they will understandably feel very attacked, even though the initial declaration isn't talking about gendered traits at all. In fact, the person saying trans women aren't women has neatly split sex and gender into two things, and decided that in spite of whatever gendered traits one possesses, sex is separate and stable underneath. As you can see, this linguistic and conceptual fog results in people talking past each other. As sexy as the "are trans women women" question is, it's a question without value. Whether someone's a woman or not isn't really the point. Policies matter. How sex and gender should be divided by law is the issue. Personal friendships and dating are private matters to be governed at your own discretion. No one should be able to bully you into interacting with them a certain way. No one should feel obligated to stay in a friendship. No one should have to explain their dating preferences. But legal policy and rights involve all of us. Those arenas involve compulsion by the state. Why do you care, the trans activist might ask? And the reason people care is because we all must submit to the regulatory force of the government. These are not solely matters of personal taste or morality. This is not about the right to be left alone. Activists want the category of gender written into the body of law and want to force others to follow those prescriptions. What might the counter-trans and trans women say to one another to clarify the issue of woman? Perhaps it could go something like this. The counter-trans might say, the biological property of woman is being an adult human female. All other traits we attach to the role woman are socially constructed and not necessary to the definition, and so adopting any of those traits does not turn one into a woman. A woman is simply a biological category one belongs to, just as we all belong to the category human. People should be free to live out whatever personality, hobbies, interests, aesthetic, behaviors, or presentation they want. But none of these change one's biological category. If you wish to live as the other sex, so be it. But you are not that sex. And you should neither deny that nor force others to deny it, nor insert yourself into single-sex spaces without serious consideration about the potential negative effect it could have on others. While in social settings with friends, acquaintances, or strangers, one's biological sex is not really that important. I understand that there, you presenting and living out as the other sex is not harmful and may be the best option for you, given the particulars of your desires or mental state. But there are settings where your biological sex still matters, in dating, sex, and marriage, in healthcare, in sex-divided sports, in changing rooms and restrooms, in abuse victim shelters, in prisons. I know that each of these spaces have their own nuances and complexities, especially for trans people existing in various stages of medical social transition, but simple self-identification and a free-for-all attitude is going to lead to abuse, trauma, and unfairness in all of these areas. In those contexts, biological sex deeply matters and needs to be the primary focus of the conversation. Meanwhile, the trans woman might say, I acknowledge that biologically I am male. However, to pretend that only biological sex matters in this conversation is to ignore human experience. Gender has always accompanied sex, and us calling it a construction or a performance doesn't take away its profound social power. You say that I should accept my birth sex and be free to express my gender however I like. This is all well and good in theory, but the truth is I like the way that I'm living now. I feel more authentic and more free. And if I were to operate in the same way as I am now, but identify as a man, I would not be readily accepted. In fact, society would treat me much more harshly as a transvestite man than they do now, as I live out my life as a woman. This talk of gender freedom is an ideal, not a reality. I don't enter single-sex spaces casually, and I don't know of anyone who does. But what else can I do? I'm not welcome in male spaces on account of my appearance. Indeed, I feel unsafe there. Talk of risk in women's spaces is so dependent upon imagined unlikely scenarios, on paternalistic thinking, on misandry. I think I deserve some consideration and empathy, given the complicated life I'm forced to lead. I'd like to be treated as a woman, an act which bears you no cost. The ask for empathy is a strong move, and not unreasonable, but so is the cry for recognition of material reality. We can quibble about definitions all day long, but ultimately what must be decided are matters of legal and moral obligation. Should law enshrine our personal feelings as a protected class? Should we be morally obligated to accept others' identities? Should society overturn itself entirely for the benefit of a few? Should we find ways to provide spaces for these individuals that degrades neither them nor anyone else? When we simply malign trans people as mentally ill perverts or counter-trans as hateful bigots, we choke out reasonable, middle ground solutions, which is a problem, because hardline policies based on birth sex are in some contexts untenable, and operating purely on self-identification isn't much more tenable. The sad fact is, these issues may require a case-by-case approach, not a single organizing principle. Reweaving, a personal take. Though I've woven in my opinions throughout this commentary here, I am reserving some space for myself to outright explain my position on the gender question. First, let's start with sex. A male is the phenotype which has developed around the production and insemination of sperm cells. A female is that phenotype which has developed around the production and insemination of its egg cells. Virtually all intersex individuals fit neatly into one or the other. In humans, there are no true hermaphrodites, because no individual can produce both gametes and be both inseminator and inseminated, as hermaphrodites do in other animal kingdoms. So unless you happen to be in that fraction of a tiny percentage of individuals with differences in sexual development, you are unambiguously male or female. Regardless of context, I use the term male and female to refer to this biological category system. And that gets us to gender, because gender is associated with sex. There are only two genders, masculine and feminine. There are no traits associated with a non-binary sex because there is no such thing. You may be a mix of gender traits, and there are individuals who are a mix of sex traits, but there's no gender null. In fact, traits that are not either masculine or feminine are not gendered traits at all. Not everything in your personality is a gender. Most of your personality isn't gender. The purpose of gender is to be understood. In my mind, it's a language system we use to communicate with others, not an internal sense of self. I've spotted a trending desire among the new transgender to not be understood. Rather than wanting to communicate their gender clearly, they wish to keep it forever enshrouded in mystery, a gender Gnosticism of ever-shifting spectrums. They believe because gender is a personal thing that everyone experiences differently, we cannot place limitations or parameters on it. But this is as practical as suggesting every person should speak in tongues. Gender is a language. For it to have any utility, it must communicate something concrete to other people. And it does. It telegraphs your sex. Imagine a man spotting an individual in a dress, makeup, and high heels. He takes them home and is shocked and angered at finding the individual underneath is a biological male. His anger isn't feeling deceived. He feels lied to. Now, the person he brought home might argue that it was not deception at all. I dressed according to my gender, because they fail to recognize that for other people, the dress is the gender, and gender communicates sex. This is why I reject the notion of gender as identity. You do not have an innate language that governs you. Words do not have innate meaning. Likewise, you do not have an innate gender. Gender is a social technology that we pick up and use for the purpose of communicating our sex and sexual intentions to others. Even those differences that have roots in biology are shaped, exaggerated, repressed, displayed, or hidden in ways that are culturally determined. This is also why I reject the notion of gender abolition. Gender, as a language and a technology, has utility. It makes it easy to spot who's male and female, and that's just helpful in so many social contexts. When we can categorize people in this way, it allows us to maintain appropriate boundaries, avoid confusion, embarrassment, or offense, and accurately anticipate interactions. Again, in my definition, I said gender is that which is associated, but not necessary to the categories of sex. It is the icing on the cake. And if you'll permit me to torture the metaphor a bit further, consider a cake without icing is edible, but bland and unappealing. On the other hand, a pile of icing without cake is a shapeless, overly saccharine blob. This is my critique of both the total pursuit of sex equality and the total pursuit of gender freedom. Form is made beautiful by freedom. Man does not live on bread alone, and humans want beauty and color in their lives. We want the flourish and fun of gender expression. But freedom is empty without form. Without the categories of sex, gender will mean nothing. Conclusion. There are those who will continue to battle using vague terms and concepts. Especially in this domain, keeping one's rhetoric unclear and obfuscated is a great advantage. A way to cast the issue into such confusion that others will, by misstep or mistake, agree with you. Much of the gender debate has been won on the grounds of complete bamboozlement. If the definition of sex and gender waltzes back and forth enough times, the argument will end with a non-committal expression of emotional empathy and a false confession of understanding where the other is coming from. Do not let this semantic whirlwind capture you. Don't agree with things merely because they feel good, or because you think they don't matter. Don't be emotionally manipulated. Don't give credence to any who claim these matters are simple. Instead, understand your own position, understand another's position, and identify the true points of contention, and how those contentions intersect on matters of law, morality, and society.